The Vanishing at Lake Angikuni. This video is the first one in which I take a viewer suggestion, so thank you Dane Tan, I hope I pronounced that right, for the idea. The topic is mysterious disappearances, in particular a story about a whole village that seemingly goes missing. I've known about this story for a while and thought this would be the perfect time to take a deeper look into it. I apologize in advance, this video might be a little everywhere as this isn't particularly a straightforward story. This story, like most I cover on this channel, has a few iterations. One of them, the more popular one, comes from a gentleman named Frank Edwards from his book Stranger Than Science, released in 1959. Many still believe that this was the original story before it was ripped off by 1,000 different people. This is not the original story. Although it's suggested he referred to a police article, Edwards probably referenced this story from a newspaper article 30 years prior. The article in question was written by Emmett E. Keller, named Vanish Eskimo Tribe Gives North Mystery Stranger Than Fiction. This allegedly real story was published on November 27, 1930 by The Bee, a newspaper from Danville, Georgia, interestingly not in Canada where the story takes place. I thought I'd mention this first in hopes that it's easier to follow. With that being said, here is how the original 1930s story goes. First off, this story takes place in the Kivalliq region of Nunavut, northern Canada, on the shores of Angikuni Lake. The article references an experienced trapper, Joe LaBelle, who frequents the area around Nunavut. It starts with LaBelle rolling up to the shores of Lake Angikuni towards an Inuit village that he's visited many times before. LaBelle beached on the shore about 100 yards from the village and began yelling a greeting while making his way towards the settlement. Instead of a response from his Inuit friends, he was greeted by two bony, nearly starved huskies that crawled towards him. Not far from where the dogs met LaBelle, there were 7 dog corpses laying on the ground. LaBelle is now suspicious. He makes his way to the village, which consisted of 6 elk-skinned huts. LaBelle enters a hut and begins investigating. He was fully expecting to find skeletons or decomposing corpses, but instead finds what you'd expect. Personal belongings of the tribespeople, deerskin parkas, boots, clothes that are in the process of being sewn, and greasy iron pots. The only bones LaBelle apparently found were of fish and deer, which were scattered all over the ground. LaBelle notes that, interesting of all, he found a rusty rifle, something the Eskimos surely wouldn't have left behind if they were vacating the area. LaBelle finds the other tents in a similar state, some of them damaged by wind. It appears the tribespeople suddenly got up and left, but never returned. There were no signs of struggle either. At this moment, LaBelle thought about an evil spirit in Inuit folklore, Thornrark. A few sources say this might be referring to Thorn Garsuk, an Inuit sky god, but I'm not too sure. From here in the story, LaBelle wanders back down to the lake, pondering about Thornrock and speculating about where these 25 individuals could have gone. He thought they may have drowned, but it seemed unlikely. At the lake, LaBelle, being followed by the 2 starving dogs, finds the strangest thing during his investigation. He notes there was a grave, a cairn built of stones, but the stones were moved off the grave into 2 separate piles next to the dirt mound. The grave itself was opened, but there was no body inside. Where did the body go? From here, LaBelle caught some fish for the starving dogs and headed out of the village before he had to spend the night there. The whole time he noted that everything looked peaceful, but the air seemed deadly. From here, somehow the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, or RCMP, got involved, but they were apparently equally as puzzled as LaBelle. During that season, Keller, the author of the story, states LaBelle went to various other Inuit villages during his travels to ask questions about the missing tribe. They all had no idea, but all blamed Thornrark. Apparently, police do discover that in an Inuit village 150 miles north of the abandoned Angikuni camp, an Inuit boy has wandered into the village. No one in the camp knew where he came from, but they took him in. Another apparent lead from the police is when an Eskimo was discovered named Samek, I think I pronounced that right, who was brought to the hospital on the Hudson Bay Railway for treatment. Police finally found a translator and wanted to question Samek about the village. It's noted that he totally denied any questions about the village and apparently only mentioned Thornrark. Police then tried getting Samek drunk to spill some information. Yeah, that apparently happened. This didn't work, however, as Samek refused the alcohol because he didn't like the taste. The 1930s article finally ends with Keller saying the police are trying their best to unravel the mystery. So far, all evidence points to that this story was originally published November 27th, 1930 in The Bee, as I mentioned previously. Days later, the article was taken up by various other newspapers, as many sources say, but as of now, we cannot find any evidence of that. The most common publication sources seem to cite is the Halifax Herald, published November 29th, 1930, titled "Tribe Lost in Barrens of North, Village of Dead Found by Wandering Trapper Joe LaBelle." I do believe this article is real, as many other sources and skeptics cite it, but it appears to be lost in time. After the story came out, it's thought to have gained some traction, but ultimately boiled away. This is until about 30 years later when Frank Edwards reincarnates the story. As I mentioned previously, Edwards published this story, albeit changing a few things, in his book Stranger Than Science, 1959. Presenting the story as fact, Edwards did change a few things. Notably, in his version titled The Vanished Village, LaBelle hiked up to the camp instead of canoeing in. LaBelle was not greeted by starving dogs after his yelling to the village, but instead found 7 dead dogs tied to tree stumps after his investigation. In this version, LaBelle finds 3 canoes beached on the lake, one of which belongs to the Inuit chief. What's interesting about this story is it's the first to cite the alleged police report of the incident, and it's alleged because no one knows if it actually happened, but we'll get to that. In his writing, Edwards suggests he only referenced the police document and not the original newspaper article. Further, I'd like to mention that the police investigation wasn't completed during Keller's publication, so it makes sense the original story wouldn't have referenced it. Anyway, in Edwards' telling, experts determine that the village has been abandoned for about 2 months, judging by some berries found in some cooking pots. Edwards then states the RCMP filed the case as unsolved. The story again gained a little traction but then died down. In November 1976, an individual named Dwight Whalen published a story in Fate magazine titled Vanishing Village Revisited, where he actually attempts to debunk both Edwards and the original article written by Keller. I need to mention that I did not actually read this story because I cannot find it anywhere. I did my best to put together quotes and tellings of the story from different sources in my research. Whalen largely dismisses the whole story. Whalen was the first published person to mention the original 1930s news article and mentions a 1931 police statement on the event. The 1931 police report, a separate one from the one Edwards cites, was allegedly released by the RCMP Commissioner Cortlandt Starnes, which contains Sergeant J. Nelson of the Paws denying the whole thing. Whalen claims to further call the MCMP at the time, in which they tell him they have no record of the event. By this, I assume they mean no record of the original police report from 1930 and the public report in 1931, though it is unclear. Whalen then concludes the whole thing was either emphasized or totally made up by both Keller and Joe LaBelle. It's cited that the publication of Whalen's story really kicks things off. It started a wave of retelling and reimagining of Edwards' story, labeled both as fiction and nonfiction. I do say Edwards' story because it seems unlikely Keller's story was even known to the general public in the late 1970s. People now attribute this vanishing village to UFOs, aliens, police cover-up, alternative dimensions, you name it. Among these waves of firm believers, of course, came the skeptics. This is where the last most cited individual comes into the timeline, John Colombo. In 1988, Colombo releases a book called Mysterious Canada, which talks about both Keller's story and Edwards' reimagining, and cites Whalen's findings. Colombo, however, seems to be the first person to quote the 1931 police document, suggesting that he's read it. This is interesting because in 1988, skeptics were able to get a hold of an RCMP historian, S.W. Horrell. Horrell is quoted in saying that officers at the time, who would have investigated the event, have no recollection of this event actually happening. Further, after carefully searching RCMP files, Horrell says they have no reports from a Joe LaBelle, no reports of sending out search parties, and no reports of strange crafts. The last one was likely a response to all the apparent UFO sightings attributed to the Angikuni Lake, well after Keller's story came out. So, this suggests the RCMP know nothing of this vanishing village everyone is so hyped about, which further suggests there was no investigation, which would mean the 1931 police report is fake. On top of this, having been uploaded for years, the RCMP's official website has a post debunking the whole Angikuni story as a urban legend, links in the description. The RCMP say the whole thing isn't true, and there is no evidence to support such a story. Additionally, the post states that the story was all just invented by Frank Edwards. But wait, Frank Edwards? We established the story was first written by Keller, something we can definitely confirm. Do the RCMP themselves not know the origin of the story? Though they probably never saw the original news article, it's cited multiple times that Keller originally wrote it. Okay, well, if the RCMP doesn't know about the original article, which dates almost 30 years prior to Edward's story, then what are the odds they don't know about the 1930 and 1931 police documents? It's definitely a reach, but considering how well-preserved documents are from that era, i.e. they aren't, perhaps the police documents no longer exist. That would be why they couldn't find it. There are a ton of other questions we could further ask ourselves, but I'll save that for the comments. It's noted that for many years, no one could find Keller's original news article either. It was only until recently, I believe 2013, where the article was finally uncovered and uploaded online. The police documents cited by so many skeptics still cannot be found to this day, and the RCMP deny they even exist. I could keep asking questions and coming up with plausible answers, but in the end, I have two explanations for the Vanishing Village story. I believe the nail is in the coffin for the Vanishing Village in two ways. With the current lead that the police reports do not exist, as stated by the RCMP, this means a few things. Namely, it's possible Joe LaBelle never even existed in the first place, as there's just no evidence of him, or at least any evidence that matches up with his timeline. Even if he does, well, it wouldn't mean anything for the timeline. Second, there is then no evidence, both written or physical, that the Angikuni village ever existed. The sources I've come across deny such a village could even survive in such a remote area. Again, the RCMP deny the whole thing ever even happened, and some deny LaBelle couldn't even have made it that far north. All we have to go off of is the story written by Keller, which have many inconsistencies in and of itself. My other explanation is, let's say the police reportings from the 1930s do exist, but are simply lost. If so, then the quotes from Sergeant Nelson would exist, giving us solid evidence that the whole thing was just one big hoax. This would give merit to both Whalen and Columbo, and yeah, big rip. It would likely be true then, something I didn't mention before, that the picture used in Keller's story isn't of Lake Angikuni. Columbo mentions it was borrowed from an ex-member of the force, really taken in 1909 at Fort Churchill. I found another person mention it was taken in Cree Village in 1909, so this seems debated as well. Regardless, following Columbo, this starts to make sense, since the original story states that Lake Angikuni is 500 miles northwest of Port Churchill, a seemingly odd place of reference for a location. So maybe Keller got that inspiration from the picture. It's possible. Also, Lake Angikuni is actually 300 miles northwest of Churchill, Canada, but I'll cut him some slack there. All in all, considering how many people doubted Keller's story to ever exist, and then it seemingly popped up out of nowhere, I do believe the 1931's police report does exist. It's just, no one knows where the hell it is. Columbo does state that it was made public and the people he mentions were in fact real people, having those positions with the RCMP. Whether or not anything from the police exists, it seems the vanishing village of Lake Angikuni is in a checkmate at all angles. This whole story has just escalated into a he said, she said game of telephone, citing unclear semi-pseudo-history as fact, all stemming from a story that has no clear evidence itself. What do you think? Do you think this story is largely debunked? Do you think the story was all just conjured up by Keller, adding to the growing catalog of anomalous fiction at the time? Do you feel it has a chance at being real? It seems in the end, perhaps, we will never know the exact facts. What are your thoughts on the vanishing village of Lake Angikuni? I'd love to talk about it in the comments. Thank you for watching this video, and if you want to see more content like this, why not subscribe to the channel? If you have any other suggestions for content, leave me a comment or email me at mt.caveat@gmail.com. Have a great day, guys, and stay safe from anything that might cause you to vanish mysteriously.